Here's something archaeologists almost never say out loud. The evidence suggests that humans may have started farming not to grow food, but to grow grain for beer. Not bread, beer. And if that's true, it means alcohol didn't come after civilization. It may have come before it. It may have caused it. That is not a fringe theory. That is a serious academic argument supported by serious archaeological evidence. And it should make you question everything you think you know about why humans stopped being nomads, built permanent settlements, developed agriculture, and eventually created the world you're living in right now. Because the answer might be sitting in a clay pot, fermenting, waiting for someone to drink it. Here's what nobody tells you about this story. We treat alcohol like a modern problem, like something that arrived with bars and bottles and happy hour, like it's a product of industrial civilization rather than something that predates civilization entirely. We have entire cultural frameworks built around the idea that drinking is a weakness, a vice, a thing that needs to be managed or controlled or abstained from. And maybe some of that is true, but none of it is new. None of it arrived with modernity. The relationship between humans and alcohol is not a story about the last few centuries. It is a story about the last several thousand years at minimum, possibly much longer. And the deeper you go into that story, the stranger and more revealing it becomes. Because this isn't really a story about alcohol. It's a story about human nature, about community, about ritual, about the almost universal human need to sometimes step outside the ordinary boundaries of consciousness and experience something different. And about why that need is so deep and so old that it may be in some sense built into us. Let's start at the very beginning. Not with the first deliberate brewing, not with the first clay pot. Let's start with the chemistry. Because before humans ever intentionally made alcohol, alcohol was already part of their world. Fermentation is not a human invention. It is a natural process that happens whenever sugars are exposed to yeast in the right conditions. And yeast is everywhere. It lives on the skin of fruit. It floats in the air. It settles on grain. Every piece of ripe fruit that falls from a tree and sits on the ground long enough will begin to ferment naturally. This has been happening for hundreds of millions of years, long before humans existed, long before primates existed, long before mammals existed. And animals have been consuming naturally fermented fruit for just as long. There is a documented phenomenon called the drunk monkey hypothesis, proposed by biologist Robert Dudley, which argues that our primate ancestors evolved a preference for the smell and taste of ripe, slightly fermented fruit because fermentation signaled caloric density and ripeness. The slight alcohol content in naturally fermenting fruit was a cue, a signal that said this fruit is at peak nutritional value. Eat it now. And the primates that could detect and were attracted to that signal ate better, survived better, and reproduced more. Which means by the time the first Homo sapiens appeared on Earth, they already had a brain that was pre-wired to respond positively to the smell and taste of fermented things. They didn't discover alcohol. They inherited a preference for it from tens of millions of years of primate evolution. Your taste for fermented things is not a modern habit. It is an ancient biological inheritance. But here's where it gets genuinely interesting. Because there is a significant difference between a primate eating naturally fermented fruit off the ground and a human deliberately creating fermented beverages. And the question is when that transition happened. When did our ancestors go from passively consuming what nature accidentally produced to actively and intentionally manufacturing it? And the honest answer is that we don't know exactly. Because alcohol, unlike stone tools or pottery or burial goods, leaves very little behind. The liquid evaporates, the organic residue degrades, the containers that held it survive only under specific conditions. Which means every date we have for ancient alcohol is a minimum, not a maximum. Every discovery pushes the origin further back. Every time archaeologists say we found the oldest evidence, they are almost certainly wrong within a few decades. Not because they're bad scientists, but because the absence of evidence for older alcohol is not evidence that older alcohol didn't exist. It almost certainly did, we just haven't found it yet. Or we never will because it degraded back into the earth tens of thousands of years ago. What we do have is a remarkable collection of physical evidence that tells a story far older than most people expect. Let's go through it chronologically, starting with the oldest confirmed evidence and working forward. Because the timeline alone is enough to fundamentally change how you think about human history. The oldest chemically confirmed evidence of a fermented alcoholic beverage comes from Jiahu in China, dating to approximately 9,000 years ago. Archaeologists found clay jars with residue that chemical analysis identified as a mixture of fermented rice, honey, and fruit. A kind of ancient mixed fermentation beverage that was clearly intentional, clearly sophisticated, and clearly not the first attempt. Nobody makes something that complex on their first try. The Jiahu beverage was the product of accumulated knowledge, experimentation, and cultural transmission across generations. Which means fermentation knowledge in China is at least 9,000 years old and almost certainly considerably older. Meanwhile, in the ancient Near East, in what is now Georgia in the Caucasus region, wine residue has been found in clay vessels dating to approximately 8,000 years ago. This is some of the oldest evidence of deliberate grape fermentation ever discovered. And again, the sophistication of the process, the deliberate cultivation of specific grape varieties, the specific vessel shapes designed for fermentation, all of this suggests that winemaking in the Caucasus was already a mature technology by 8,000 years ago. It didn't start there. It started earlier, somewhere, in a form we haven't found yet. In ancient Mesopotamia, in the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, beer was not just consumed. It was documented, written about, celebrated, regulated, traded, used as currency, paid as wages, and given to the gods. The oldest written recipe in human history, recorded on a Sumerian clay tablet over 4,000 years old, is a recipe for beer. Not bread, not stew, not any other food, beer. The oldest thing humans ever thought was important enough to write down and preserve for future generations was how to make an alcoholic beverage. Let that sit with you for a moment. The very first use of the written word, one of the most transformative technologies in the history of human civilization, was applied to the production of alcohol. Because clearly that was the priority. And honestly, from a survival standpoint, it makes complete sense. Beer in the ancient world was not what beer is today. It was not a recreational beverage consumed for enjoyment at the end of a workday. It was a nutritional staple, a calorie source. A safer alternative to water in a world where water sources were frequently contaminated. The fermentation process killed pathogens. The slight alcohol content made it safer to consume than untreated river water. Beer was, in the most literal sense, a health technology, a survival tool, a way of processing grain into a form that could be stored, transported, and consumed without the risk of killing everyone who drank it. Ancient Mesopotamian workers were paid partly in beer. Temple workers, pyramid builders, soldiers, laborers of every kind received beer as part of their compensation. It was a currency backed by calories and safety in a world where both were precious. Now here is where the story takes its most genuinely radical turn. Because for most of human history, the assumption has been that agriculture came first. That humans figured out how to farm, which gave them a stable food supply, which gave them the surplus that allowed for permanent settlements, which allowed for specialization of labor, which allowed for the development of writing and mathematics and governance and everything else we associate with civilization. That's the standard model. Farm first, civilization follows. And for a long time, nobody questioned it. But a growing body of archaeological evidence has been quietly and persistently suggesting something much stranger. That in at least some cases, and possibly in more cases than we currently recognize, the direction of causation was reversed. That humans may have started farming not primarily to grow food, but to grow the raw materials needed for the deliberate and reliable production of alcohol. The Neolithic Revolution, the transition from nomadic hunter-gatherer life to settled agricultural life, may have been driven at least in part by the desire to make fermented beverages at scale. This is called the beer before bread hypothesis. And it is not a fringe idea promoted by people who want an excuse to drink. It is a serious, peer-reviewed, academically debated theory supported by physical evidence from multiple sites. The site of Göbekli Tepe in what is now Turkey is one of the most important pieces of evidence in this argument. Göbekli Tepe is the oldest known monumental architecture on Earth, dating to approximately 11,500 years ago. That is more than 6,000 years before Stonehenge, more than 7,000 years before the pyramids. And the people who built it were not farmers, they were hunter-gatherers, which is already extraordinary and almost impossible to explain using the standard model of civilization. But what makes it even more extraordinary is the physical evidence found at the site. Archaeologists discovered large stone vessels, some with a capacity of up to 160 liters, that showed chemical residue consistent with the large-scale production and consumption of fermented grain beverages, beer. At the oldest monumental architecture site on Earth built by hunter-gatherers, there was evidence of industrial-scale beer production. And the implications of that are profound. It suggests that the desire to produce alcohol at scale was a motivating factor in the construction of permanent gathering sites. That the communal production and consumption of fermented beverages was not a consequence of settled civilization, but one of its causes. That humans built the first temples not just to worship their gods, but to drink together in their honor. And that the transition to agriculture may have been, at least in part, the practical solution to the problem of how to ensure a reliable supply of grain for brewing. Now, before we go any further, we need to talk about something that runs through this entire story and connects every thread. Why? Why did ancient humans want to alter their consciousness in the first place? Why was the desire to ferment things and consume them apparently universal across every culture that has ever existed? Because this universality is itself one of the most remarkable facts in all of anthropology. There is no human culture, past or present, that has not developed some form of psychoactive substance use. Not one. Every culture that has ever been documented has found some way to alter consciousness. Whether through alcohol or through plant-based substances or through ritual practices like drumming and dancing and fasting and sleep deprivation that produce altered states without chemical assistance, this universality suggests that the desire to alter consciousness is not a cultural artifact, not something that was learned or transmitted or adopted from neighboring cultures. It is something that appears to emerge independently in every human group, in every environment, under every set of conditions, which means it is almost certainly an expression of something deep in human nature, something that preceded culture, something that may be in some form hardwired. And the most compelling explanation, the one that keeps appearing in the anthropological literature, is that the desire to alter consciousness is fundamentally social. That it is not primarily about individual pleasure or individual escape, though those things are real, but about the creation and maintenance of group bonds. About the experience of shared altered states that create a sense of connection and trust and mutual vulnerability that is very difficult to achieve any other way. When a group of people get drunk together, something happens neurologically that is genuinely remarkable. Inhibitions lower, social walls come down. Oxytocin levels rise. People share things they wouldn't share sober. They laugh together. They cry together. They commit to each other in ways that feel permanent and real in the moment. And whatever the limitations of that kind of connection, whatever the complications and the hangovers and the risks, it produces a quality of group cohesion that had real survival value in a world where the size and strength of your group was often the difference between life and death. Drinking together was social technology. It was how ancient humans built trust at scale. It was how they turned strangers into allies and allies into something closer to family. And the archaeological evidence supports this interpretation in ways that are almost uncomfortably direct. The fermentation vessels found at ancient sites are almost always large. Not individual serving sizes, not personal cups. Vessels designed to hold enough liquid to serve a group. The drinking vessels found at ancient sites are almost always found together in clusters, suggesting communal consumption rather than individual drinking. The evidence from sites like Göbekli Tepe and from ancient Andean chicha production sites and from Neolithic European mead halls all points consistently in the same direction. Ancient alcohol was primarily a communal experience. It was produced collectively, consumed collectively, and its primary function appears to have been the creation and maintenance of social bonds. The ritual dimension of this is also impossible to ignore. At virtually every site where ancient alcohol production has been documented, there is also evidence of ritual activity. In ancient Sumeria, beer was offered to the gods before it was consumed by humans. In ancient Egypt, beer was placed in tombs for the dead to drink in the afterlife. In ancient Greece, wine was the medium through which humans communicated with Dionysus, the god of transformation and transcendence. In the Andean cultures of South America, chicha, a fermented corn beverage, was used in rituals that connected the living to the dead and to the cosmic forces that govern the world. In ancient Northern Europe, mead made from fermented honey was the drink of warriors and kings, celebrated in epic poetry, consumed in the great mead halls that were the centers of political and social life. And in sub-Saharan Africa, traditional fermented beverages made from sorghum and millet and palm sap have been produced continuously for thousands of years, embedded in social and ritual life in ways that parallel the patterns we see everywhere else on Earth. The specific ingredients changed. The specific processes changed. The specific rituals changed. But the impulse, the desire, the human need to take something from the natural world and transform it through fermentation into something that alters experience, that was everywhere, always, without exception. Now here's where it lands on you, because it always does. The relationship you have with alcohol, whatever it is, whether you drink or you don't, whether you enjoy it or you avoid it, whether it has been a source of pleasure or a source of pain in your life, is not a product of modernity. It is not a consequence of living in a world that makes alcohol cheap and available and commercially exploited. Your relationship with alcohol is built on top of a relationship that is thousands of years old. The craving for that particular alteration of consciousness, the social pull of drinking with other people, the ritual quality that even casual drinking tends to acquire over time. The way certain drinks become associated with certain occasions and certain memories and certain people. All of that has roots that go back to clay pots in ancient China and stone vessels at Göbekli Tepe and reeds who have found in fermented beverages something that speaks to a need that is genuinely, authentically, irreducibly human. The need to lower the walls between yourself and other people. The need to mark certain moments as special. The need to participate in something communal that transcends ordinary daily experience. The need to occasionally step outside the boundaries of your own individual consciousness and feel, however briefly and however imperfectly, that you are part of something larger. Ancient humans found that in a clay pot left too long in the sun. They found it in fermented grain and honey and fruit and sap and every other thing that yeast could transform. And they built around it rituals and traditions and social structures that have persisted in transformed but recognizable forms all the way to the present. The next time you raise a glass with people you care about, you are doing something that humans have been doing for at least 9,000 years. Probably longer. You are participating in one of the oldest human rituals there is. One of the most universal, one of the most persistently, stubbornly, unmistakably human. The details have changed. The vessels have changed, the ingredients have changed, the occasion has changed. But the impulse is the same. It has always been the same. And it is older than farming, older than cities, older than writing, older probably than anything else we think of as civilization. Because it may be, in some deep and uncomfortable and genuinely fascinating sense, one of the things that made civilization possible in the first place. Some habits are not habits. Some of them are just who we are.